All right, Kim, what's on your radar?
What happened to the progressive anti-establishment left? I open up my Twitter feed and I see Bernie Sanders, someone so independent he labels himself as such, an AOC who ran against the Democratic establishment, joining the chorus of big money interests and elites to support Gavin Newsom. Now, neither of these two even rep California, yet here they are telling their supporters to do what they can to help an entrenched Democratic establishment governor keep his seat. Now, what does it matter to either of them what happens to Gavin Newsom, and why are either of them carrying water for the Democratic establishment? An establishment that has tried to undercut each of them at different times. What happened? Trump derangement syndrome is what happened. And then a pandemic, that's what. And maybe some other forces like incredibly good Democratic strategists, perhaps. The establishment is so good at stoking the flames of fear in people, they can get nearly anyone to abandon their principles of fighting for the people and get them to inadvertently defend the elites instead. It's a trick as old as time, and it's not only worked on Bernie and AOC, it's worked on anti-war Democrats during the Bush and Obama years. It got liberal and some progressive commentators to obsess over Russia and certainly over race under Trump. And most recently, it's worked on populist progressives during this pandemic. The weapon? Fear and charm. Now, fear is how the establishment Democrats like Joe Biden were able to talk war-weary liberals into supporting post-9/11 restrictions, such as the Patriot Act, which he largely wrote, and the invasion in Iraq, which he supported. Obama's charm kept it going even further. Though he ran on ending wars and making change, by the time his 8 years were up, the establishment had effectively transitioned the Democratic voting base and pundits from ones that had supported a candidate who ran on ending wars to supporting Hillary Clinton, a candidate who had been on the wrong side of every anti-war activist. And if you weren't with her, you were a sexist Bernie bro who cost her the election to a racist, or you were a Russian asset. Most of the voting base didn't want to be either of these things, so they just folded, and many of the establishment and independent media went right along with them. But many of the Bernie bros held strong. The movement didn't wane like the establishment had hoped. In fact, it was growing, so new narratives were necessary. What could they use to get these anti-establishment progressives to fall in line? Now, they tried Russia, and that worked like a charm to keep ratings hot for mainstream media. But it seemed really unlikely that so many Bernie supporters would buy the idea that Russia cost Hillary the election. After all, she was incredibly unpopular with the progressive wing, and many Bernie supporters were upset at the DNC for interfering during the primary. But nonetheless, some of the most prominent progressive outlets on YouTube brought the narrative and ran with Russiagate. Their hatred for Trump was so strong, they needed him to be a Manchurian candidate who was out to destroy America. Anyone who wasn't going along with their idea was supporting fascists. But as the Russia narrative began to fall apart, the focus shifted to racism. And I think we can trace it back to the BLM movement as the impetus of what really moved the AOC progressive wing back into the establishment. The elites figured out how to crack the progressive code and stoke the right fears to get that wing of the party to vote blue no matter who, even if that who is Joe Biden, a man with a history that, much like Hillary, goes against absolutely everything every progressive activist championed. Once progressive juggernauts like Bernie and AOC were in the establishment's fold, talk of Medicare for all pretty much went by the wayside, even oddly during a pandemic. And instead, the focus shifted to fighting misinformation, defeating white supremacists, and of course, climate, none of which are really threatening to the establishment, like reforming big insurance and big pharma are. Actually, AOC demanding that big tech fight against misinformation only helped them. Big tech stood to gain more overreach, power, and defense contracts. So much for these two fighting against big money interests. But not all of the progressives fell in line as the establishment had hoped. There still remained staunch anti-establishment populist holdouts, many of which were powerful voices online. They didn't buy into Russiagate, and they felt racism was a distraction from the real issues plaguing our nation, economics. But one by one, over the past year and a half, many of the last anti-establishment progressive holdouts joined the chorus being sung by Pelosi and her ilk. Stay home, shutter your small business, and order Amazon. And if you don't, you're using Wall Street talking points. Don't talk about Medicare for all during a pandemic. Instead, cancel all holidays and don't overwhelm our lacking medical system. If you're going to go outside, make sure it's only to protest Trump's racism. Otherwise, stay home and wait for Big Pharma to come up with a cure. And don't even think about what Sweden's doing. We can't live with the virus. We need to crush it. Definitely don't talk about inexpensive, cheap treatments that might work. Again, wait for big pharma and don't ask questions about how much money they're making because they're saving your life. And by the way, Joe Biden, one of the most establishment Democrats in the book, is a hero. Pay no attention to the fact he moved the withdrawal date back 4 months and yet still didn't take that extra time to evacuate Americans, high-risk Afghans, or even our equipment. He's a hero, even though he droned an innocent family of 10, including 7 children, on his way out the door. It's been mind-bending watching how well the Democratic establishment has been able to bring back into its fold every single fractured wing of the party. From the original anti-war liberals to the Bernie bros to the anti-establishment populist holdouts, everyone is now back within Mama Bear Pelosi and good old Uncle Joe's loving embrace. Yet the party didn't fundamentally change. Nothing fundamentally changed. The only thing that did were the voters, the pundits, and their tolerance, acceptance, and even complicity of an expanding surveillance state, increased censorship, mandates, demonizing others who are dangerous, be they racist, sexist, white terrorists, or anti-vaxxers, and praising big money industries and war hawks as heroes. And as the rich get richer and the security state expands, not only are people who were once considered allies not stopping it, but they seem to be cheering it on. So this is something that has really been frightening to me to see. And now I feel like I'm on an island all alone. Ryan, it was funny because actually, I believe it was when we were interviewing Michael Moore. And before we went on, he asked you, who is everybody and how do they align? And you said, we had Robbie with us, who was the libertarian, and you were on the left, and you were like, Kim, what are you? What are you? And it's true. I feel like I have been alienated out. I mean, I was a progressive leftist, and now I feel like I'm on an island all alone by myself, of course, being called a right winger by people who look at people like myself or Glenn Greenwald, and they say, oh, these guys, they no longer fit in. So, I'm curious what happened. What do you think from your perspective? Do you think that the establishment just got better and more progressive, and that's how they were able to get everybody in? Or I'm really curious for your thinking on that.
Yeah, no, I don't think you're alone. I think you represent, a pretty substantial portion of what I kind of think of as the YouTube left or YouTube populism, and I think it flowed out of both the Tulsi Gabbard campaign, but also people, the kind of the Bernie or bust movement, like people who felt like once Bernie had been screwed in 2016, the Democratic Party was irredeemable, and so then that created a faction of it. And then in 2020, he's beaten again. This time with rapid consolidation among the establishment, and you get another kind of cohort of Bernie or busters who join with the kind of Tulsi Gabbard, and that creates this kind of anti-democratic, kind of anti-electoralism almost element of YouTube, and so that is a strong faction that that exists online. So I don't think you're alone at all. But it's fascinating to me to watch it, and that's one reason I've been happy to do this show, so I can kind of engage with this particular audience. Because at the same time that you have these, definitely hundreds of thousands of people saying that the party is completely irredeemable, here I'm watching with my own eyes Congress debate immigration reform that would create a path to citizenship for 10+ million people, hundreds of billions of dollars in climate investments, which you said doesn't target the establishment. Big oil is a massive part of the establishment, and they are fighting this tooth and nail. This week, they're going to mark up $2.9 trillion in tax increases geared to the wealthy to pay for trillions of dollars of social reforms, including hundreds of billions, could be trillions, going towards kids and working families. Major parts of the PRO Act, which is sweeping labor reform that corporate America absolutely despises, is also included in this package. Now,
right, but I'll believe it when I see it.
Fall apart,
I mean,
but these hundreds these hundreds of thousands of people have not lifted a finger to even talk about it. You could search all of these YouTube channels for the term reconciliation or any of the elements that I just talked about, and you won't find it. So
because again, it's we don't believe it until we see it. I mean, they're always talking a big game, and then they never really actually come through.
But it's not a sporting event. What is that like?
It's like it's worth talking about once it happens. I think a lot of us feel that way. Like, okay,
other people think it's worth engaging in while it can still change.
Yeah, maybe. But I mean, it just feels like, okay, it's just another, more tokens. And I mean, we'll see. We'll see how the package ends up.
It's sort of like Pascal's wager to me. Like, Pascal's wager was, he's like, I don't know if there's a God or not.
But you're better off believing, than not just in case there is.
Right. So, Rachel, is there an element of this on the right that participates in the political conversation in order to say that nobody should have any hope in progress?
Yeah, it's called the conservative wing of the Republican Party. I'm so fascinated by this dynamic because it does very much play out in a similar way on the right. Although what I've always respected about the Democrats is something that you touched on. I think, Kim, your frustrations are reflected a lot on the right in the sense that, it's the weight of the majority. It's the burden of the majority is that you have to get everybody singing off the same song sheet. And you see it when the parties flip, right? When the Republicans have the majorities in Congress and the White House, it's like, oh, we have to do everything that our guy is saying and no man left behind kind of thing. But, Republicans, or from where I said, I've always admired the fact that, to the point that you just made, Republicans, my friend Chris Bedford likes to say, they get a majority for the sake of it, to put it on the shelf and to shine it and to stare at it and say, isn't that nice? But Democrats, to their credit, and we're going to talk a little bit about this reconciliation bill and what they're going after, they are not holding back. They are going full in on $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill with $2.9 trillion worth of pay-fors in it. Now, Kim, you're right. It may get totally bullocksed up in the process. But, it's something that the conservatives look at the progressive left and they're like, well, we couldn't even repeal Obamacare with reconciliation. And look what these guys are doing. So.
Right, yeah. Obamacare is underwater big time with Republicans, and they couldn't even get rid of it. So, I don't know. We'll see. The smart money is always on Democrats failing. And if that's where people put their money, there's a good chance they'll be right. But it's not a guarantee. And so, to me, you got to fight until there's no time left on the clock.
Yeah.
Next on Rising, Emily Jashinsky is back for Team Rising. We'll be discussing the latest developments in the saga of Hunter Biden's emails. Stay tuned.